That looks like a hard cliff to climb, but I did it in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Uh, okay. Now, some of you know already, because I talk about movies a lot, I realize that, but I'm a huge fan of classic movies. Uh, it's just that I love them so much, and I just can't wait until our monthly movie group starts up again. Going to the county theater on a Friday night, it's so much fun. Anyway, one of my all-time favorite classics is called The Best Years of Our Lives. It's directed by William Wyler in 1946. It is about the challenges faced by three veterans returning home after World War II, and it rightfully won just about every Academy Award that year. It is that good. Now, there are a lot of great moments in that movie, but one of the very best is when a 20-something-year-old daughter, played by Teresa Wright, is anguished about a relationship. Now, tearfully, she tells her parents, who are played by Frederick March and Myrna Loy, that because they're so old and their marriage has been so perfect, they can't possibly understand what she's been going through, what it means to be young and in love, and how to navigate a complicated romance with a man who happens to be married. Frederick March and Myrna Loy share a knowing glance, and they proceed to inform their daughter about all the times that they had fought and struggled in their own relationship, which is complete news to Teresa Wright's character. She is astonished and upset by their revelation, so she runs out of the room, having a complete meltdown. It's a great scene because it illustrates an idea known in academic circles as being blinded by modernity. Modernity blindness simply means that to one degree or another, we all have a bias toward believing that whatever we are going through in our present modern moment is completely unique. Any stress, any conflict, any hardship can feel like we're the very first person on the planet to have ever discovered it and suffered through it. Now, the same thing can happen with positive things we experience too. Like, I am the first person to truly appreciate and really understand the beauty of a sunset. Actually, I am. Not really. Kind of. But have you ever noticed how many, for instance, parenting books and articles are published by people who've only recently had their first child? It's as if, though, no one else before them has ever gone through the joys and the strains of parenthood. So this author writes the definitive how-to child-rearing manual based on their vast experience of the past 12 months. And it's not that their advice is bad, it's that it's written from the point of view that they are like Christopher Columbus discovering the New World, while the rest of us are regarded as the indigenous population who's lived there for thousands of years. What do we know? But your age really has nothing to do with it. I still find myself sometimes, when something new comes along that I have to deal with, believing the world would really benefit from my deep insight. Let me show you how to operate that circular saw, really, the right way, because I got this one for Christmas and I know everything. I'm a past master. Modernity blindness is especially common these days because of how fast things are changing with technology and social media. So the thinking goes, if you're not up on the latest thing, then you can't possibly grasp why it's so cool and indispensable. Only this young, incredibly hip generation truly gets it and appreciates why it matters so much. Now, it's true that I'll never understand some aspects of TikTok, and it's even more true that I will never use it myself. I think it's absurdly narcissistic. And more than that, I just don't care. But I completely get the concept behind it because it's nothing new. The idea that people enjoy showing other people what they're up to, that they're sharing a short form story of sorts, and that other people are interested in other people in general and their stories in particular, well, that's as old as humanity itself. It's why Facebook exists, ostensibly. Facebook actually exists to sell all of our information to the highest bidder. But that's another sermon. But lost in all the noise over the newness and novelty of all the variations of social media that are now available is that very basic and ancient principle of being interested in each other. We've been doing social media ever since our naked, hairy ancestors gathered around campfires at night to reenact that day's hunt for the woolly mammoth. Over time, those mammoth hunt stories and a lot of other stories coalesced into certain common types of stories, and today we call those stories myths. Tales about the origins of the world, stories about human nature, stories about the relationship between our lives and destiny, and the natural and the spiritual realm. Now, naturally, a lot of those stories made it into the Bible, with specific names and places attached. That's what happens to really old stories. As they're told and retold, they're adapted to be even more specific and more relevant to the audience that's hearing them at that time. Part of the challenge with modernity blindness is that in hearing old stories, we can assume that our modern, current understanding of things is vastly superior to that of our ancestors. After all, they didn't have TikTok, so how could they possibly know anything worth our time? I've seen that happen a lot with things in the Bible. We hear Bible stories, and what do we picture? People wearing robes and sandals and looking serious and who don't have air conditioning or 5K connectivity. And our bias can be, well, that's interesting. But aside from being a nice old tale about people who don't have Amazon Prime or Costco, what possible relevance does this have for me? Our bias is the people in those stories, bless their sweet, antiquated hearts, would be so blown away by how much better and smarter and capable we are today, and they would be unable to function. And they simply would never understand our modern challenges, the complexity of our world today, and how hard it is to deal with my in-laws who think I'm not good enough for their daughter. They would never get that I lose sleep over if I'll ever have enough money to retire, or if my son, who's on the spectrum, will ever have friends or be able to hold down a job. What good are these old myths and stories in the Bible when I'm dealing with real world stuff here? I get that. I suppose you could say I'm a professional Bible reader, and even I can get lost in that bias sometimes. It's true enough that modern life has modern challenges. We have plenty to occupy our hearts and minds these days. For Pete's sake, we're just emerging from a pandemic. There continues to be rampant racial and economic injustice. Gun violence is something we've become so accustomed to, we veer back and forth between weary, mournful resignation and outrage. But like so many problems, we never seem to arrive at any clear-cut solutions. So I do ask myself, what can the Bible really tell me? How can this sacred set of books guide me in the here and now? Now, some folks really don't like to hear that the Bible, not the whole thing, but quite a lot of it, was derived originally from old myths and stories. They're afraid that saying that somehow takes away its sacredness. Because, after all, it's supposed to be the Word of God, right? But what if for a moment we set aside our need for the Bible to be something we worship, something too holy to ever question, and instead we understood it as a product of human insight and wisdom and mystery that reaches much farther back in time? That is not to deny God's involvement in those stories and myths at all. It's just to admit what scholars have known for centuries, that in the Bible we're seeing a compilation, kind of a greatest hits album of stories from antiquity that tell us how human beings really tick, no matter if it's in the ancient world or right now or sometime in the future. And because that's true, we can actually learn something about who we are and the challenges we're going through today. Who knows? The Bible may actually be relevant and not just some old dusty book that religious people are really into. A great case in point is that story about David and Goliath. So often the way it's told to us, or what we're told it means, is that it is a moral lesson about how underdogs can overcome the odds and be successful, especially if you trust in God. Now, there is some value in seeing it that way, but there's really so much more to it. The story goes that Goliath, a giant and the champion of the Philistines, the bad guys, challenged the Israelites, the good guys, to send out their champion to decide the outcome of their ongoing war. So, because, it was a common practice in the ancient world that was known as single combat. Your best guy against our best guy. All the Israelites were way too afraid to face the fearsome Goliath, except for David, who wasn't even part of the army. He was just a shepherd boy. He was a skinny little runt. So, despite the insurmountable odds, going against a well armed and trained warrior who happened to be a giant, David was undaunted. He brought only a sling and a sack of rocks against Goliath's huge sword and shield. As Goliath charged in for the kill, David found a vulnerable spot in his opponent's armor and slung one of his stones there. His precise throw hit Goliath in the head and knocked him out, allowing David to move in for the kill and win the entire war for the Israelites. So David's the big hero, and from a faith standpoint, David attributes his victory to trusting that God would protect him. He is, after all, already known to the reader, to us, to be God's anointed one, destined for greatness, the future king. So what if we went beyond that basic Sunday school version of this myth? Aside from David's courage and faith, which are not always things that you and I can just pull out of a hat, what can we learn from this that would matter to us today when we're facing some kind of gigantic, fearsome issue? Well, first we learn that speed and agility really matters. At first glance, Goliath just seems unbeatable, much bigger, much stronger. David could never match Goliath's brute strength, but Goliath was also wearing heavy armor, which slowed him way down. David refused to wear armor, so he was quick and agile. He could pivot. He wasn't encumbered by anything. And that wasn't the only way that David simply refused to play by the established rules. He couldn't win if he fought on Goliath's terms of hand-to-hand combat that was close up, fighting with a big sword. Instead, David stood far back and used a sling. Now, the sling was not a toy. It was a deadly long-range precision weapon, but it was not something you would ever use in single combat. It just wasn't done that way. Real soldiers were supposed to get up close and personal, but David didn't care. In that situation, the sling worked perfectly. So this isn't just a story about courage and faith or about beating the odds. The truth is, David had Goliath beat before he ever stepped out onto the battlefield. Goliath never even stood a chance. So this is a myth about the power of confronting an old challenge by approaching it in a completely new way. The Philistine army and the Israelite army had been engaged in this long, bloody war that neither side could ever win. But in a matter of minutes, David changed everything simply by changing the rules. That's the real lesson at the center of this story. And that's a lesson that we see played out every single day today. Organizations, large and small, succeed because someone questions the rules that everyone else in the organization assumes are carved in stone. Think about it. The most admired business leaders are inevitably those who reinvented the way their business operated. Organizations like churches discover that they can do so much more to help and to serve other people. In other words, to actually fulfill their mission of loving their neighbor and sharing God's love, the reason the church exists, when they realize that the traditional impulse to preserve and perpetuate the church as an institution can become an end into itself and completely get in the way of serving others. I see that all the time. And when churches do that, when they place a much higher priority on self-preservation and on glorifying their traditions instead of prioritizing serving others beyond themselves, that church inevitably dies and shrinks. And the David and Goliath lesson can be very personal too. Individuals can reconcile with enemies when they put away their egos and simply refuse to engage with them as enemies anymore. It's an old proverb, but the best way of eliminating your enemy is to make them your friend. Relationships can be mended when at least one person in the conflict decides that creating a peaceful and loving future with that other person matters a whole lot more in the big scheme of things than steaming and stewing over the past. Approaching old challenges in new ways, throwing out the traditional playbook, that's the lesson of David and Goliath. And it's a myth because a myth is really never a lie. It always tells a timeless truth about the way that humans operate in the world. And you know, the Bible is chock full of these kinds of stories. The Bible is not the only collection of books that tell us about ourselves. Every faith tradition has sacred scripture, of course. But our collection of those stories, the Bible, works wonderfully and is sacred because woven into these stories or people from long ago and far away who are wearing robes and sandals, we not only see ourselves and our own challenges and our own joys, but how we can be our best selves, how we can live today in harmony and in peace and acceptance and love with ourselves and with one another. Because consistently, in every last book of the Bible, the common thread woven through is that God made this world for just that purpose. For you and me to have life and to have it abundantly and joyfully, no matter how many big scary giants we face every day. Our sacred myths tell us, don't worry, those giants have all been dealt with before plenty of times. And here's how.